Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, and Ms. Ramesh Rajasingham, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths. Martin, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to start by extending my warmest wishes to the people of Yemen, of course, firstly, and to Muslims across the world for the holy month of Ramadan. Mr. President, I'm coming to this council yet again to express hope instead of to report success. And this is frustrating at a time when the spread of COVID-19 and a global economic downturn threaten to cause even more adversity in a country that has already experienced more than nearly any other, and I am sure we will be hearing much detail from Ramesh on that in due course. The United Nations has provided a feasible roadmap to the parties, which I will describe in a minute. And now it's up to them, to those with arms and power, to make the decisions to achieve the objectives set out there. Mr. President, since the Secretary General's March call for a ceasefire globally and then in Yemen, people across Yemen have been speaking out forcefully to demand peace. And in response to that, I shared with the government of Yemen, the distinguished ambassador here, and Ansarallah at the end of March draft agreements on, firstly, a nationwide ceasefire, secondly, humanitarian and economic measures, and thirdly, the urgent resumption of the political process, as we have discussed in this council before. And since then, and still now, I have been engaged in intensive negotiations with the parties, identifying and building on points of convergence and, of course, proposing compromise texts where differences remain. I'm pleased to report that we have seen significant progress on these negotiations, in particular with respect to the nationwide ceasefire. And this is the most important element, of course, of these three that are in front of the parties. And it responds directly to those calls from across Yemen who desperately need a measure of calm to return to their lives. However, the ceasefire is part of the broader package that needs to be agreed in full. And differences remain on some of the humanitarian and economic measures in that package. And Mr. President, I firmly believe that all the measures in front of the parties are necessary and indeed overdue. They are not new issues. The UN has been calling for progress on those issues for a long time, including in Sweden 17 months ago. They are there for the people of Yemen. They're not there for the interests of one party or another, but for the people of Yemen. And the parties should be able to agree on how to move forward with them quickly. And I emphasize the word should. These humanitarian and economic measures are also needed to help Yemen counter COVID-19, which is spreading at an unknown rate, given very low levels of testing. And the measures include, suggested by my colleague Lise Grandi, the resident humanitarian coordinator, and the WHO country representative, include the creation of a joint operations cell between the parties to counter the virus. And they would enable medical supplies and personnel to reach vulnerable populations, now a very, very urgent priority indeed. They also include a reaffirmation of the parties' prior commitments to release conflict-related detainees. And in this regard, I hope and indeed expect that the parties will immediately move forward with an implementation plan for the large-scale releases that we have discussed before and that they already committed to in February in Amman. I am extremely frustrated that so many Yemeni families have had to wait unnecessarily for additional months to be reunited with their loved ones. And the details of implementation should not be allowed to become another matter for drawn-out negotiations. Mr. President, the government of Yemen has engaged very constructively with the UN's proposals. This is extremely encouraging, and I am grateful to them. Thank you. Ansar Allah has engaged seriously and positively with my proposals, and these are important indications of the willingness of the parties to make many of the compromises needed, as in any negotiation, but those, in this case, to bring an end to the war in Yemen. And the negotiations have benefited, again, as we have discussed before when we were last together, from concerted international and regional diplomatic support, including, particularly from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, from Oman, from members of this Council and others in the region and elsewhere. And I'm also grateful, and I should note that here, to the coalition, the Saudi-led coalition, to support the legitimacy for extending its ceasefire through the month of Ramadan. However, the people of Yemen are right to be frustrated about the slow pace of these negotiations. We all hope to see these negotiations soon come to a successful close. Mr. President, women's rights activists have shed light on the terrible consequences of this conflict for women and girls. Yemeni women have repeatedly demonstrated their leadership and activism, leading calls for a ceasefire, the proposal that is in front of us, the release of prisoners also, and assisting the civilian population. I regularly consult the Yemeni Women's Technical Advisory Group, a group of Yemeni women whose aim is also to help me focus and my mission. And my office is in contact with a diverse array of women's organizations. Women must continue to be at the forefront of peace efforts. I'm convinced about this, and I therefore want here to reiterate my call that the parties include women in their negotiation delegations and decision-making in line with the outcomes of the national dialogue, that extraordinary achievement of the Yemeni people some years ago. Mr. President, the 3rd of May marked World Press Freedom Day. This was a reminder to all of us of the extraordinary risks that journalists globally and equally in Yemen take to do their jobs. Without this reporting, we would be in the dark about much of the real costs of this conflict. The conflict has created an increasingly repressive environment for the media, and all parties have an obligation to protect journalists and uphold freedom of the press. I'm particularly concerned about the convictions, which include death sentences, by a Sana-based court last month to 10 journalists, and we would like to see them all released. Mr. President, the military situation in Yemen, despite these negotiations on the details of a nationwide ceasefire, despite that, the military situation remains extremely concerning. In my last 2 briefings, I raised alarm about the battle in Marib, the governorate to the east of Sana'a. And to my dismay, hostilities there continue to this day. And we're also seeing heavy fighting, no doubt linked in part to that battleground, in Al-Bayda and Al-Dali governorates. In Hodeidah, ceasefire violations continue all too often. I'm particularly concerned by the regular shelling of residential areas in the city and in southern districts. UNMHA, the UN mission for the Hodeidah Agreement, led by General Guha, continues to sustain dialogue with both parties, but its work is under strain. I regret to report that Colonel Mohammed al-Sulehi from the Government of Yemen, a Government of Yemen liaison officer in that mission, who was shot in March, has died of his injuries. The death of Colonel al-Sulehi was tragic, and I extend my sincerest condolences to his family. I hope that the parties will find a way to overcome their mistrust and reactivate the Redeployment Coordination Committee and the joint mechanisms to implement the Hodeidah Agreement. But further, Mr. President, I'm deeply concerned about the situation, of course, in the south, where a perfect storm is brewing. The people of Aden, in particular, face outbreaks of COVID-19 and other diseases believed to include malaria, cholera, dengue, and others. Deaths are rising daily, but nobody knows exactly why, because the health system is so ill-equipped to diagnose and treat people. Exceptionally heavy flooding in late April had led to the damage of infrastructure and homes, exposing ailing infrastructure and exacerbating already very considerable daily power outages. And long deteriorating public services are now at breaking point. Aden is an example of the horrors that attend Yemen. And amidst this precarious backdrop, the Southern Transitional Council's declaration of 25th of April is particularly troubling. I am alarmed by their subsequent steps to make local institutions in Aden answerable to them. Adding to this dreadful mix, military tensions are now rising in the south, particularly in Abyan and also in Socotra. I call for immediate restraint. I call on the Government of Yemen and the Southern Transitional Council to intensify their efforts towards the urgent resumption of the implementation of the Riyadh Agreement, as you remember, Mr. President, mediated by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia last October. Implementation would help ensure responsive governance, so crucial to the people in the south, and improved service delivery in Aden and elsewhere. It would also, of great importance to me, provide for the SDC's inclusion in the government's negotiation delegation in a resumed UN-led political process, which we hope is not too far off. And this is important. This inclusion is important to make that political process more inclusive. Mr. President, I want to raise another concerning development. On 16th of April, Ansarallah announced it would withdraw funds from the special account in the Hodeidah branch of the Central Bank of Yemen. My office has repeatedly requested documentation from Ansarallah that is needed to verify the special account activity. Indeed, I have written to the leadership to personally reiterate this request, and we're working now with both parties to find a way forward in that imbroglio. It is our intention, after the agreements that I have described and that we are negotiating are, I hope, adopted, that the parties will swiftly resume that long-delayed political process that we have discussed so frequently. This process would be aimed at concluding an agreement to comprehensively end the conflict and outline political and security arrangements for that transitional period leading to accountable elected government. The transitional period would give Yemen an opportunity to escape the misery of conflict. It would allow for the focus to shift toward reconstruction, recovery, and reconciliation, and it would pave the way for a future, and I would like to remind us of what this future might be, which instead of hunger, sickness, and loss, provides that Yemenis' essential needs would be met, their families would be safe, journalists would freely report, freedom of movement would be upheld, women would speak out and lead without risking repression, and instead of anxiety and bleakness, Yemeni youth would hold high hopes for their futures. And I want to say that to remind us that this is the vision the people of Yemen have for a return of civility in Yemen when this conflict is resolved. Yemen's state institutions, of course, would serve citizens equitably, and differences would be resolved in this vision through partnership and dialogue. Mr. President, I insist that such a future for Yemen is eminently realistic, and it's possible. The draft agreements that my office has put on the table would place Yemen at the beginning of this path. The outcome is in the hands of the parties, and this Council has a vital role to play in supporting them, and through them the Yemeni people, along that path towards peace. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Martin. And I now give the floor to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham. Ramesh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning. In last month's briefing, we reported that Yemen had only one case of COVID-19. As of this morning, their figure is 72 confirmed cases, including 13 deaths. 62 of these cases, more than 85%, reported in just the last 10 days. Humanitarian agencies have every reason to believe that community transmission is taking place across the country. Official reports are lagging behind actual infection, just as they have done in many other places. And as in the rest of the world, millions of people in Yemen are deeply frightened at the prospect of an unknown disease ravaging their country. The Secretary General acknowledged this fear last month, noting that people everywhere want to know what to do and where to turn for advice. He also urged that the global approach to COVID-19 be transparent, responsive, and accountable. Authorities in Yemen are seeking support. We must all work together to confront this virus. This means reporting cases everywhere, keeping people informed, caring for the sick, and following expert advice. This approach has flattened the curve in other countries, and it can do the same in Yemen. This is the backdrop against which I will update you today on the 5 overall priorities for the wider response. 1, protection of civilians. 2, humanitarian access and delivery. 3, funding. 4, the economy. And 5, progress towards peace. Let us start with the protection of civilians. We welcome the coalition's decision to extend its unilateral ceasefire to the holy month of Ramadan. Like the Special Envoy, we hope this will soon translate into a mutual agreement to end all fighting. Recent clashes in Hodeidah, Marib, as Martin just mentioned, Al-Jauf, Al-Baida, Abiyan, Sokot, and elsewhere show we are not there yet. Civilian casualties rose again in April, with 177 civilians killed or injured across the country. In the first quarter of 2020, 6 attacks on health facilities were reported, a 3-fold increase from the previous quarter. At least one such attack was reported in April, despite the pandemic. International humanitarian law requires all parties to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects throughout military operations. COVID-19 makes it all the more critical to respect and protect medical in line with international law. COVID-19 appears to be directly exacerbating infection risks. On 6 April, armed men threw grenades at the guards of an isolation center hospital in Al-Dali. And the fear of stigma may also be leading fewer people to seek medical care when they need it. For refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, stigma is already a grave concern. Reports are growing of refugees and migrants forcibly deported or detained due to COVID-19 fears. Incitement against these people, many of you whom already endured horrific trauma on their journey to Yemen, rise. I want to echo recent calls by the Secretary General, the World Health Organization, the International Organization for Migration, in favor of knowledge and social community over rumor and scapegoat. Truly, this is the time for what the Secretary has called science and solidarity. Over the years, Yemen has distinguished itself with its generous support for refugees and migrants. The United Nations remains eager to support many authorities, communities in upholding their noble traditions as we work with them to counter COVID across the country. Mr. President, the second issue is humanitarian action, which is also required by international humanitarian law. We are working with all stakeholders to take appropriate precautions against COVID-19 while maintaining life-saving assistance. There are several causes for concern. Regular staff rotations are impossible. Aid workers lack predictable access into or out of the country. Nor do we know whether medical evacuations, if required, will be quickly approved. These issues are essential to fulfilling our duty of care. We've also noted a disturbing increase, mainly in the north, harassment and incitement against the United States. This needlessly makes our work more dangerous and sometimes forces partners to pause activities at the time when they're needed the most. We are asking the government of Yemen, Ansar Allah, to work with us on these points as a matter of urgency, including renewed commitments to aid workers' safety and security. I want to acknowledge the constructive role of member states in helping facilitate passenger flights. The government of Ethiopia has allowed the Humanitarian Air Service to use Addis Ababa for several flights. The evacuation and humanitarian operations in Riyadh has also been helpful. Unfortunately, we continue to face obstacles to our work that predate the pandemic. In the south, the biggest challenge remains volatility, rising tensions and renewed in governance and services, as well as complicating agencies' ability to plan and implement programs reliably. Government processes are too cumbersome and at times interfere with independent state. Dozens of NGO projects have gone months waiting for approvals in the south, effectively blocking $100 million in donating. Visa delays of international staff also a concern. In the north, access challenges are even more severe. As we noted last month, the authorities have recently made several important improvements and we appreciate this progress. But more is still needed. The most urgent priority is to approve 93 pending NGO projects, many of which have been waiting for months, and together represent $180 million in donor investments. We also need more effective procedures for future projects and an end to arbitrary movement delays, tensions, harassment, and interference in aid operations. Over the last several days, we have had the opportunity to remind senior Ansar Allah officials of all the steps required to put in place the same minimum humanitarian conditions expected everywhere else in the world. We will continue to work with them to achieve the quick results we need to create a more enabling environment for humanitarian action. On a separate note, we also continue to call for action to the decaying Safa al-Time. Last week, a senior representative of the authorities in Sana'a wrote to the United Nations to highlight the urgent necessity of an assessment. We welcome this enthusiasm and confirm that Ansar Allah authorities will indeed facilitate work again imposing unnecessary conditions. Mr. President, despite the enormous challenges that teams are facing, we are doing everything we can to stay and deliver, to reach as many people as possible. There are many factors impacting our capacity to deliver aid, including restrictions, lack of funding, and measures we are forced to take to mitigate this phase. This said, we're still reaching more than 10 million people every month. These large-scale programs provide food, water, healthcare, and other services. They offer some of the best chances for people to protect themselves against COVID-19. COVID-specific activities are also expanding. 38 hospitals are being equipped to service COVID-19. Rapid response teams are working in every district. Health workers are being trained and essential supplies delivered, including ventilators, tests, reagents, and personal protective items for health workers. Massive amounts of COVID-19 supplies are needed across, which is why we are asking everyone to give Yemen highest priority in COVID-19 global supply chains. But Mr. President, we desperately need money to fix these programs. This brings me to my third point, funding for the aid operation. The World Health Organization recently wrote to the government of Yemen and Ansar Allah to inform them that WHO must progressively reduce their activities due to a lack of funding. The COVID-19 rapid response team that I just mentioned will shut down next month. Therapeutic feeding centers, which treat the most severely malnourished children, will close by August. Amidst a pandemic, this is shocking. Preventing disease and feeding sick children are the kinds of programs that everyone agrees should be protected at all costs. Other essential activities are also. Of 41 major UN programs, 31 will start closing down in the next few weeks if we cannot secure additional funds. That means many more people are likely to die. We are urgently appealing to donors to release funds now to sustain principal aid operations. Aid agencies estimate they will need up to $2 billion to cover essential activities from June through December. These requirements reflect a tightly prioritized strategy that will be published later this year. The strategy is based on painstaking work agencies have done over the last few months to ensure manageable levels of risk in a country where millions of people are acutely vulnerable and need help. On 2 June, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Nations will host a virtual pledging conference. This event offers an important opportunity to show civilians the international community will not abandon them while they urgently need. Donors have started to signal support, including a large pledge from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and an announcement of the lifeline funding from the United States. But pledges remain far below what is required, and most still have not been paid. By themselves, pledges cannot save lives. We are calling on all donors to pledge generously and pay quickly, ideally before the 2 June event. We realize aid budgets are shrinking everywhere. Greatly appreciate donor support. Mr. President, the fourth issue is the economy. Yemen imports almost everything. For the last several months, commercial food imports through Hodeidah and Sadi have been falling. In April, they totaled just 95,000, one of the lowest figures. Fuel imports rose considerably in the same period, likely due to lower oil. Imports must be paid for in hard currency. A weak Yemeni rial, about 600 riyals to the US dollar in the north, 690 riyals, means fewer people can afford the basic goods. The current exchange rate is 3 times higher than before the crisis, and is severely limiting the government's ability to finance imports or pay for public service. COVID-19 is poised to make these dynamics even worse. Remittances from abroad, the largest source of foreign exchange in Yemen, are falling, though it is difficult to quantify by how much. Yemenis who still have jobs at home often depend on day labor. These workers need daily wages for their families. Many will be ill-equipped to restrict movements or comply with similar COVID regulation. We need bold action to stabilize the economy and soften the blow of measures that may be necessary to protect public health. This support should include regular foreign exchange injections, steps to quickly increase quantities of affordable food and other goods in market. As much as possible, Yemeni migrants should be allowed to continue working abroad. Mr. President, my last point is progress towards peace. Peace is the best chance Yemen has to continue COVID-19, and we hope the parties work with the Special Envoy to make it a reality. This is essential not just for but for the sake of millions of Yemenis who, even before this pandemic, were exhausted after 5 years of a war they never wanted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements, and I first give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also thank Martin and Ramesh for their briefings. I find myself feeling a little that here we are again. We're thanking the two of you for your ongoing and painstaking efforts in extremely difficult circumstances. Martin, for your resilience in trying constantly and consistently to shepherd the parties into talks. And Ramesh, for you and your team's long-term efforts in what is one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world. So with a very genuine sense that I thank you on behalf of the United Kingdom and your teams for what you're doing. Colleagues, at a time that Yemenis are reflecting and offering each other Ramadan blessings, they're being hit by the plight of COVID-19. Official figures, as Ramesh has said, tell us that COVID-19 has caused well over 50 deaths. And UK-funded modelling suggests the number of Yemenis suffering from COVID-19 is already in the thousands. The United Kingdom has provided over $940 million since the beginning of the pandemic to support the global response to COVID-19. And we've also pledged $2 billion to Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to vaccinate 75 million children against deadly infectious disease around the world. But I want to encourage the government and the Houthi authorities to continue engaging with the United Nations to ensure an effective national response. We also call on the Houthi authorities to be transparent in reporting cases so that the World Health Organization can identify requirements, procure equipment, and ensure supplies reach those in need. Martin Griffiths' proposals for a political framework and a nationwide ceasefire really are the only game in town. There is no military option. We've proved that over several years. Those delaying agreement and delaying talks are simply prolonging the misery of the people of Yemen for no obvious strategic or tactical advantage. So the United Kingdom is resolute in supporting Martin Griffiths' efforts, and I welcome the close coordination of P5 ambassadors to Yemen in this endeavour. I welcome your update, Martin, that you have received responses to your most recent proposals from the government of Yemen. And so I urge also the Houthis to do the same. You said that they were engaged, but I think we need more than engagement. Yemenis cannot wait any longer, and constructive engagement in the UN-led process is the only way to achieve the peace they deserve. And I want to echo Martin's comments on the importance of the inclusion of women in both his advisory council, but also in the talks process. In the light of the COVID-19 outbreak, I want to welcome again the unilateral ceasefire and its subsequent extension announced by the Saudi-led coalition. It is important that fighting does not hamper efforts to tackle the outbreak. This move, which has not been reciprocated, demonstrates the serious intent of the coalition to bring an end to this dreadful conflict. And during this particularly crucial time in the peace process, I want to note with concern the evidence documented in the United States letter of 21st of April to the sanction committees established under resolutions 2231 and 2140. That letter outlines evidence collected during 2 interdictions of vessels containing significant amounts of weapons and arms of apparent Iranian origin. I welcome the sharing of such information. I encourage others to do the same. Such arms shipments pose a grave impediment to the cause of peace in Yemen, and they must stop. The tragic situation in Yemen has been complicated further following the, to say the least, poorly timed declaration of the Southern Transitional Council. And I want to welcome the swiftly agreed Security Council statement of 29th of April regarding that declaration and highlight the ongoing risk of violent clashes in the south. All parties have recommitted their support for the Riyadh Agreement, and so I call on them to engage with the Saudi-led efforts and de-escalate and implement their obligations under the agreement. We welcome the announcement that a humanitarian pledging conference will take place virtually on the 2nd of June, and Ramesh gave us details of that. And we strongly urge all donors to step up and provide significant and timely humanitarian funding. The United Kingdom has provided over $1 billion in funding since the conflict began. And in this year, we will also be making a substantial pledge. Note with concern, though, that across Yemen, unprecedented access restrictions remain. In the north, the Houthis must deliver on the minimum operating requirements that the international community has clearly set out. These include swiftly approving all sub-agreements, fully implementing the World Food Programme's retargeting and biometric pilot, and allowing humanitarian agencies to operate independently and freely. Donors will only be able to give funding if such restrictions are lifted and humanitarian organisations are able to deliver assistance effectively. And we are supportive of UN agency efforts to do everything they can to reduce risk and ensure aid is reaching those in need. We remain extremely concerned that the Central Bank of Yemen will soon run out of foreign currency reserves, causing an economic collapse with humanitarian and political consequences. Significant external financial assistance to the Central Bank of Yemen is urgently needed to keep imports coming in. And that risk is now even more unpredictable due to the secondary impacts of the COVID-19 outbreak. It is imperative that the government of Yemen urgently comes up with a credible plan that reassures potential donors and that the Riyadh Agreement is enacted, with the Central Bank of Yemen remaining operationally neutral as negotiations proceed. Now, we've talked previously in this council about the devastating impact that an oil leak from the Safa oil tanker would have on Yemen and the region. I urge the Houthis again to either allow the removal of the oil or to allow a repair mission to proceed. Continued inaction on this issue is reckless, dangerous, and threatens an environmental and humanitarian catastrophe. I also want to note that prior to Ramadan, the Houthis promised to release members of the persecuted Baha'i faith. I call on them to do so, and all who have been wrongly detained, including journalists, as set out by Martin Griffiths today, and that is especially important in the context of COVID-19. Finally, let me finish where I began. I want to thank Martin again for his continued efforts. He was right to talk at the beginning of his remarks of bringing us hope over progress, just as he is right to say that the hope is realistic. And I call on all in Yemen to bring real hope to the people of Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We don't hear you, Rhonda. If you can unmute your microphone. You must reboot probably, or
Mr. President, you may wish to go to the next speaker.
Yeah, I'm going to the next speaker. You can refresh the page or maybe reboot. I now go to give the floor to Belgium. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to our two briefers, Martin and Ramesh. Let me begin with the announcement by the Southern Transitional Council. And Martin spoke of a perfect storm in preparation. So we are concerned. And we urge all parties to exercise restraint and to engage in an inclusive dialogue that addresses all concerns, all legitimate concerns of all Yemenis, including in the south. We emphasize the importance of implementing the Riyadh and Stockholm agreements, and we encourage continued political engagement under the auspices of the UN. We, of course, fully support the efforts of the Special Envoy during a nationwide ceasefire. We support his efforts towards confidence-building measures and the restart of an inclusive political process. In this regard, we welcome the extension of the coalition's unilateral ceasefire, and we urge the Houthis to join the government of Yemen and immediately follow suit. The humanitarian situation described by Mr. Rajasingham remains deeply disturbing. Half of the people in need, about 2.2 million people, are children. As more cases of COVID are confirmed, I commend OCHA and the entire humanitarian community in Yemen for their efforts to save lives and preserve dignity. In response to your call last month for increased financing, Belgium will continue its contribution of 5 million euros to Yemen's country-based pool fund this year. In these dire pandemic times for us all, our solidarity with the fate of the Yemeni people remains strong. Belgium's humanitarian assistance will reach a record amount of almost 200 million euro this year, with a strong focus on flexible disbursements mechanism such as SURF and CBPFs. I also would like to reiterate the importance of humanitarian access. We remain concerned about the obstruction of the humanitarian assistance, and we remind all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. And there must be accountability for violations. Women have been particularly impacted by the crisis in Yemen. We are extremely concerned about reports of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, as well as intimidation and arbitrary detention, including of women human rights defenders. As Martin noted, it is impressive what women-led civil society organizations are achieving, such as negotiating prisoner releases, often with little means or official recognition. So we urge parties to fulfill their commitments for women to fully and meaningfully participate in the peace process, including by implementing the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security. And we count on the Special Envoy and we support what he said, this commitment to promote and facilitate this. Finally, I repeat the importance of economic recovery and once again, the importance of access for the United Nations to the safer tanker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I now give the floor back to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Rhonda, I hope the microphone is working.
Yeah, thank you, Sven. Can you hear me now? Lovely, thank you. And once again, I welcome both our briefers, and I thank them for their continued commitment to the Yemeni people. Mr. President, it is with regret that we must now accept that Yemen is fighting on two fronts. Years of war have destroyed many of the country's institutions, and now the Yemeni people are contending with COVID-19, the transmission of which continues to increase. As a result of the long-standing conflict, Yemen's healthcare system has been shattered and is under strain, with only half of its hospitals operational. Most of the population still desperately needs humanitarian aid, as they lack food, drinking water, fuel, and access to healthcare. In this regard, the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian relief in accordance with international law is key for the survival of many people. The scaling down of some operations and possible closure of others represent the difference between life and death, and we take this opportunity to thank those countries and agencies that continue to sustain aid operations through their donations. The impact of COVID-19 will be felt acutely across the country, where many are grappling with lost livelihoods. Yemen remains the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and it is unthinkable that the humanitarian needs of people will be worsened with the impact of COVID-19. It is critical, therefore, that the international community assists in strengthening the capacity of the Yemeni government to protect lives and livelihoods in the future. It is in this context, of course, that we welcome the humanitarian pledging conference elaborated by Ramesh earlier. Amidst the COVID-19 response, there remains a need for a political solution to the protracted crisis. We do welcome the extension of the ceasefire, and we emphasize the need for Yemeni responsibility and collective ownership over the political process in Yemen. This is the only path to a dignified advancement of Yemen, its institutions and political expressions. In order to strengthen the socio-cultural rubric necessary for sustainable peace, it is critical that all groups in society be included throughout the political process. We conclude, Mr. President, by underscoring yet again the need for progress to be made in addressing concerns over the Safer oil tanker, which threatens the marine environment, as well as the lives of many people in the region. Like Martin, I remain hopeful on behalf of the Yemeni people that sustainable peace can be achieved and dignity restored. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Vietnam. Queen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank SIG Martin Griffiths and AASG Ramesh Rajasingham for their insightful briefings and updates. I welcome the permanent representative Yemen to our meeting today. Mr. President, once again, Vietnam welcomes the unilateral ceasefires of the coalitions and all efforts to protect civilians to save lives, especially amid the COVID-19 pandemic. We reaffirm our support for the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Yemen, but we remain concerned about the recent situation in the country. On humanitarian issues, Vietnam welcomes the timely deliveries of the medical equipment and other supply to the United Nations humanitarian teams, and stress that it is high time to assist doctors and humanitarian workers to do their work at the best ability to help Yemeni people to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. However, Vietnam requests to know that the World Health Organization orders staff to cease work in the Houthi-controlled area. We are concerned that hundreds of humanitarian projects of the NGOs has not been conducted. The fight against COVID-19 pandemic could not be fully implemented if humanitarian access continue to be hindered. Vietnam shares concerns raised by other members of the Council about the continuous decrease in funding from donors. Yemen receives only $455 million out of $2 billion needed for humanitarian operation from June 2020 to December 2020. Against this backdrop, my delegation wishes to share the following observation. First, we urge all parties to come to an immediate and nationwide ceasefire in order to facilitate the humanitarian work and the fight against the COVID-19. The World Health Organization has warned that there would be a full-blown transmission of virus to Yemen. Therefore, it is compulsory for the concerned party to cease hostility and cooperate with United Nations teams to fight against the pandemic. Second, we support the effort by the United Nations and other partners in organizing the donor conference for Yemen expected to take place on June 2nd, 2020. And we call all international donors and other partners to fulfill their pledge to fund humanitarian operations in the country. Third, we join the other members to call on all relevant parties to fully implement the Stockholm Agreement and the Riyadh Agreement with the United Nations mediation. We also stress the importance of ensuring a meaningful participation of women in the political process and the protection of women and children. Fourth, We call on all parties to consolidate their cooperation with and support for with the Martin Griffiths three-pillar approach, including nationwide ceasefire agreement, confidence building measures, and restart the Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned inclusive political process. We also urge the government of Yemen and the Houthi to reinforce their engagement with a view to reaching an agreement on the special envoy proposal as soon as possible. In conclusion, Mr. President, we commend the tireless works and support the peace proposal by SIG Martin Griffiths and the United Nations country team. We call for closer cooperation and further effort from United Nations, international partners, and all parties in Yemen to stop ongoing hostility, to ensure unimpeded access to humanitarian aid, and join hands to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Kui. I now give the floor to France, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like also to thank our briefers for their comprehensive updates. In addition to continued warfare, Yemen is now facing the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is high time that the Yemeni parties seize the opportunity to make peace by agreeing an immediate and lasting ceasefire and by engaging and agreeing a comprehensive political solution. A global and immediate ceasefire, as called by the UN Secretary General, is indeed required to fight the pandemic. France welcomes in that regard the announcement by Saudi Arabia on behalf of the coalition to unilaterally cease their attacks for another month. Nevertheless, my country remains preoccupied that fighting is still ongoing in various areas of Yemen. We reiterate our call on those fighting in Yemen to immediately cease hostilities. It is now more than essential that they fully engage with the Special Envoy to reach a nationwide and lasting ceasefire. It is also the more necessary to pursue efforts for the parties to accept the crisis meeting that the Special Envoy has called for, at least to coordinate efforts to fight the pandemic. France therefore calls on the parties to continue in a more constructive manner and without delay their discussions on Martin Griffiths' proposals for a ceasefire, confidence-building measures, and the resumption of a political settlement of the crisis. We would like to reiterate our full support to Martin Griffiths to this end. Women's participation also must be ensured. France also urges the government of Yemen and the STC to fully implement the Riyadh Agreement in the south of Yemen, where the calm and the cessation of hostilities should prevail. The STC must respect the territorial integrity and the unity of Yemen. Mr. President, all parties must respect international humanitarian law, in particular protect civilians and civilian infrastructures, and they must ensure a safe and unhindered humanitarian access, including protection of humanitarian and health personnel and facilities. It is more necessary than ever to facilitate the response to the COVID-19 crisis. We are, of course, as others, deeply worried by the spread of the pandemic in Yemen. The Yemeni population is extremely vulnerable, including a very high proportion of children, as the permanent representative of Belgium recalled. Only half of the medical infrastructures are fully operational, while humanitarian needs have not stopped increasing in a country where already 80% of the population depend on humanitarian assistance for their survival. The financial and economic consequences of the pandemic are also already felt, further weakening and hurting one of the most deprived people in the world. Mr. President, efforts to prevent and respond to the spread of the pandemic must be scaled up. It is crucial to overcome the current shortage of essential supplies and equipments, including tests, protective equipment, and ventilators. Coordination between all the relevant actors, including Yemeni parties, is key in this regard, as our briefers have highlighted. Humanitarian and health personnel and facilities must be protected and supported and get the access and freedom of movement they need. Lastly, it is crucial and urgent to ensure UN access to the Safar oil tanker, which constitutes a serious threat to the environment. An oil leak will have a dramatic impact on the region, and continued inaction, as stressed by previous speakers, is dangerous. Mr. President, to conclude, France remains fully engaged and committed to find a solution to end the war in Yemen, and more broadly, to ensure de-escalation in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to the Russian Federation. Vasily, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Envoy Martin Griffiths and Acting ASG Ramesh Rajasingham for the briefings. To our regret, we have to note that information from Yemen indicates how fragile is the situation in the country. We hear reports about fighting continuing in both northern and southern regions of Yemen. We welcome the ceasefire announced by the Arab coalition and called on its members to adhere to this commitment, as we call on all Yemeni parties to do the same. In this regard, we encourage parties to implement the Riyadh agreements between the government of Yemen and the Southern Transition Council. This would contribute not only to the stabilization in the south of Yemen, but also for prospects of this throughout the country. Progress on implementation of the Stockholm Agreement, reached in December 2018, is regrettably very modest, so we encourage parties to fulfill their commitments. We reaffirm our consistent position on the need for cessation of armed confrontation and launch of inclusive inter-Yemeni talks with the mediation of the UN and Martin Griffiths. We are convinced that progress towards the settlement of numerous problems facing Yemen, including its territorial and state structure, can be achieved only through inclusive dialogue which reflects interests of all the country's leading political forces. In this regard, we supported recent statements of the Security Council, including those in line with the appeal by the UN Secretary General to a ceasefire, to stop the confrontation and take necessary steps to combat the spread of coronavirus pandemic in the country. In contacts with parties involved, we will support such efforts. But we must not forget about the need to fight terrorism, as armed confrontation in Yemen contributes to strengthening of terrorist groups there. We hope that all players of the Yemeni political landscape will respond positively to the efforts undertaken by Martin to organize contacts of representatives of the Yemeni government and the Ansar Allah with the participation of the Arab coalition in order to de-escalate the situation, ensure a sustainable ceasefire, and launch a comprehensive political process. We call on all Yemeni parties to actively engage on Special Envoy's proposals for confidence building measures. For our part, we will continue to do our utmost to facilitate the establishment of such a dialogue under the UN auspices. At the moment, the priority to provide humanitarian assistance to Yemenis and to help them to counter the threat of COVID-19 pandemic, it is the priority. Humanitarian situation in the country remains dire. Russia, like other UN member states, will continue to contribute to helping the people of Yemen. At the same time, humanitarian aid coming to Yemen from abroad should be distributed on a non-discriminatory basis among entire population in all parts of the country, regardless of who control this or that territory. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Vasily. And now I give the floor to Tunisia. Guys, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the beginning, I thank Special Envoy Griffiths and Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Ramesh Rajasingham for their briefing, and I would like to reiterate Tunisia's support for their efforts for the resumption of the political process and the improvement of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. I also extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Abdullah Sadi, the permanent representative of Yemen. We have been closely following the recent turn of events in Yemen, which risk escalating the already dire situation on the political, military, and humanitarian levels. In this regard, we restate that there is no military solution for the crisis in Yemen, which can be resolved only through peaceful dialogue, political dialogue on the basis of the agreed terms of reference, namely the Gulf Cooperation Council Initiative and its implementation mechanism, the outcome of the Comprehensive National Dialogue Conference and the Security Council Resolution 2216. As we express our concern about the Southern Transitional Council's declaration relating to self-administration, which is detrimental to the process of political settlement in Yemen, we urge full implementation of the Riyadh Agreement, and we call the concerned parties to renounce unilateral actions to change the situation and to re-engage in the political process provided under the Riyadh Agreement. In the same vein, we emphasize the full implementation of Al-Hodeidah Agreement by all parties. We consider all forms of escalatory action unhelpful, especially at these difficult times when the war-shattered country is threatened by COVID-19 pandemic. They contribute in putting the Yemeni people under high risks, deepen its suffering, and threaten to impede the efforts of the Special Envoy to revive political negotiations. Mr. President, Tunisia reiterates its commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Yemen. We fully support the efforts aiming at enhancing confidence-building measures and achieving a peaceful, negotiated settlement which is urgently needed to end the suffering of the Yemeni people. The situation driven by 5 years of war has caused economic collapse, degradation of infrastructure, a breakdown of public institutions and services, and an unprecedented humanitarian crisis which remains the worst in the world, with millions in urgent need for assistance and protection and hundreds of thousands of displaced people living in very precarious conditions. We consider that all this should come to an end through cessation of hostilities and the full engagement in the political track, which is the essence of a sustainable solution. In the context of the global spread and devastating effects of COVID-19, we urge all parties in Yemen to put the interests of the Yemeni people first and join hands in fighting the pandemic, and we call upon the international community to strengthen its support in these difficult times. In conclusion, we renew our call for an urgent assessment of the oil tanker suffer to find a way out without delay in order to prevent an environmental disaster from the oil spill. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Niger. Habari, please.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Mr. Martin Griffiths and Mr. Rajasingham for their briefings on recent development in Yemen. I also welcome Ambassador Abdullah of Yemen. Last month, we welcomed not only the unilateral ceasefire announced by the coalition, but also the prospect for a comprehensive cessation of hostilities in Yemen through the very encouraging peace initiative proposed by the Assistant Secretary General. The current situation on the ground, marked in particular by the declaration of the Southern Transitional Council, which proclaims the autonomy of southern Yemen, is deeply worrisome and reminds us that our hopes were short-lived and that our mobilization must be even stronger. My delegation calls on all parties to respect the various agreements previously reached and calls on them to resume dialogue. Today, more than ever, the parties in conflict in Yemen must convince themselves that military force will not resolve their differences. In the light of events happening in the south, and with a view to future peace negotiations, a more inclusive approach is needed to achieve a comprehensive and lasting settlement of the conflict, which involves, in addition to the government and the Houthis, the other major representative groups in the country, including women. We also call on regional actors and council members with influence to the parties to spare no effort to help move the ceasefire talks forward. Mr. President, the continuation of fighting in the country, particularly in Aden, Marib, and Al-Baida, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, would slow down the flow of basic products and medicines throughout the country and worsen the already difficult living conditions of thousands of families. That is why we urge the warring parties to take greater responsibility to put an end to the military offensives. We call on them to lift restrictions on the movement of humanitarian agencies to provide aid and assistance to a population that has been suffering for years from war and whose level of general immunity is decreasing day by day. We appeal to the international community and to the Security Council in particular to spare no effort to prevent the worsening of one of the most catastrophic humanitarian situations the world have ever experienced. In conclusion, Nigeria affirms its full support for Mr. Griffiths' continued effort to silence the guns in Yemen and to bring the parties to make peace in this country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Germany. Jürgen, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me first of all thank our two briefers for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, as our briefers have reminded us, Yemen is right now in an extremely dire situation. And it's a combination of factors that further complicates and exacerbates the crisis in Yemen. It's the continued fighting, and we've heard about all the many places where fighting unfortunately continues to occur. We have heard about the upsurge in confirmed COVID-19 cases, and we know that these numbers may not reflect the whole extent of the pandemic and its implications yet. And we have taken note again of the fact that the implementation of the Riyadh agreement has not made any progress. So all this leads to a pretty bleak picture. And we can only hope that Yemen and the Yemeni people can overcome this on the basis of the suggestions made by our briefers this morning. Now, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Yemen must be respected. And while we condemn the steps taken by the Transitional Council, the Southern Transitional Council, it is also a sign that we must not forget the situation in the south. The declaration of self-administration by the so-called Southern Transitional Council in the south has fueled, unfortunately, tension in the southern part of the country, and that deserves our full attention. The Riyadh agreement, which lays the right basis for an inclusive political process in Yemen, needs to be implemented. And countries with influence on the parties obviously need to step up their pressure wherever they can do so. But a continuation of the escalation in the south would be a further blow to the political process, as embryonic as it may be. Mr. President, the parties to the conflict need to agree on a countrywide ceasefire, as Martin Griffiths has reminded us today, as part of a broader package, a package that also needs to include confidence-building measures and a serious and inclusive political process. This is, from our point of view, without any alternative. And this requires and deserves our full and active support. We urge the government of Yemen and the Houthis to agree to the Special Envoy's latest proposals and engage constructively and seriously on substance in the process to follow. We stress that all discussions have to be led on the basis of his proposals. We do not see any alternative at this point in time. 5 years into the conflict, the situation is worse than ever, and the pandemic must not lead to more suffering, more fighting, and more deaths. Unfortunately, thus far, the conflict parties appear to seek individual gains from the situation at the expense of the Yemeni population. This is very unfortunate and has to stop. Mr. President, Martin Griffiths also has reminded us that women's rights activists in Yemen have shed light on the terrible consequences of this conflict for women and girls. And Yemeni women have indeed repeatedly demonstrated their leadership by leading calls for ceasefire, the release of prisoners, and assisting civilians. All this highlights once again what we have been discussing here many times in the Council, that women must be at the forefront of peace efforts in bringing about peace as well as in implementing and sustaining peace. Mr. President, a word on the humanitarian situation. Even before the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, Yemen has been characterized as one of the countries most affected by humanitarian challenges. By many accounts, Yemen has been qualified as the most affected country in the world, with the worst humanitarian crisis in the entire world. Now, this is further exacerbated and complicated by the current COVID-19 pandemic and its repercussions. The country is critically equipped to face a highly contagious disease like COVID-19, while at the same time dealing with recurrent outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. Many health facilities have been destroyed, and it is absolutely critical, more than ever, and we have said this before the outbreak of COVID-19, but it's all the more important that we say it now, that all parties must fully adhere to international humanitarian law and human rights law and protect the vulnerable in these difficult circumstances. We also need complete transparency on the spread of the pandemic because this is crucial for an effective and efficient response. Call on all parties to cooperate in dealing with the pandemic over military and political front lines. And we must do everything to jointly prevent the situation in Yemen from becoming even more catastrophic. We've heard about the restrictions today, the many restrictions when it comes to humanitarian assistance that OCHA reminded us of. The restrictions on humanitarian assistance must be lifted immediately, and we need tangible milestones with regards to the so-called 7S that we need to achieve so that humanitarian partners can provide life-saving assistance in Yemen and facilitate an effective response to the COVID-19 outbreak. In particular, full access into and within Yemen for international aid workers, medicine and medical supplies must be ensured and access granted to those in need. As we know, Yemen imports nearly everything, so it is critical that not only humanitarian aid, but also essential commercial goods are allowed to enter the country without cost-driving delays. We have heard about the stigmatization of migrants and refugees related to COVID-19 in the briefings. This is absolutely unacceptable, and we have to constructively work together to minimize the risk for the vulnerable population, especially for displaced persons who are even at a higher risk. We very much welcome the pledging conference at the beginning of June. The funding the largest humanitarian operation in the world has always been a challenge, but funding for increased needs due to COVID-19 must not affect the funding of existing life-saving programs. Germany remains committed to its support to the humanitarian operation in Yemen and will continue to provide substantial funding. Now, before concluding, Mr. President, maybe a question to Martin Griffiths and also to OCHA. To Martin, maybe we listened very carefully to your briefing, Martin, but how can the Security Council and each member further increase the pressure on the parties to respond positively to the proposals you put on the table? That, I think, seems to us a key question. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, we'd be very interested to learn about this. And to OCHA, you talked about the conference, the pledging conference at the beginning of June. This is obviously an important milestone. We heard about your ideas about this, but if you could maybe further elaborate on your strategic goals for that particular conference, that would be extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to South Africa. Jerry, please.
Mr. President, first, let me thank Special Envoy Martin Griffiths and Ramesh, Deputy at OCHA, for their briefings. Zambia echoes its support for you, Martin, in seeking a peaceful solution to the situation in Yemen amidst a calamitous circumstances of COVID-19 pandemic. Ramesh, you have given a very worrying reports, especially the imminent closure of much needed health services provided by WHO and numerous NGOs. We hope that a donor community will respond generously to the June 2 meeting that you talked about, Ramesh. Mr. President, we'd like to welcome Permanent Representative of Yemen to this morning's Security Council deliberations. My delegation would like to reiterate that the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen persists because it's linked to the political impasse. As such, our intervention will focus on two elements. One, on a humanitarian situation. South Africa notes that there are a growing number of confirmed COVID-19 cases and deaths, with only half of the health facilities across the country fully functional due to previous heavy bombings and attacks. Yemen is simply not equipped to handle a full-scale COVID outbreak. The virus is now reaching the north of Yemen, home to some of the most vulnerable children and families in this humanitarian catastrophe. If this crisis is not addressed, Mr. President, an entire generation will suffer long-term physical and psychological consequences. In line with and supporting UN Secretary General call for global ceasefire in the context of this deadly pandemic and to allow humanitarian access unhindered, South Africa welcomes the ongoing measures taken by both national government of Accord and Houthis to curb the spread of COVID-19 by closing airports, schools, cafes, and wedding halls to varying degrees, as well as conducting temperature tests at several entry points to the country. These actions, Mr. President, highlight the ability of both sides to work together towards a common goal. However, the violence must stop so that the Yemeni people, health workers, and aid organizations can focus on slowing the spread of virus and mitigating its social and economic impact. In view of this, South Africa urges the parties to the conflict to allow expert staff to travel to all affected parts of Yemen to provide much-needed support and other humanitarian relief necessary. We further press upon all parties to avoid actions that will deprive civilians of their right to food and health care. We remind the parties to the conflict that all necessary measures should be taken to respect their obligations to the Geneva Convention. Mr. President, non-political impasse, it is important that all parties avoid compounding the current humanitarian disaster and commit to resuming the political negotiations process. The key to a peaceful resolutions lies in the political willingness of all parties to the conflict to meaningfully engage in discussions and be amenable to conceding some of their demands, which will result in lasting peace in Yemen and will allow for rebuilding of the country. There have been no further implication of Riyadh agreement. South Africa wishes to reiterate its call for the implementation of this vital agreement between the Yemeni government and the Southern Transitional Council, as well as the full implementation of the December 2018 Stockholm Agreement. The Stockholm Agreement, Mr. President, and process is key to the lasting peace, stability, and ultimate prosperity of Yemen. South Africa encourages the parties to the conflict to pursue new confidence-building measures, such as 1, the release of detainees and prisoners, 2, an agreement on the set of nationwide measures to combat COVID-19, 3, the release of vessels held by either party in the seas off the coast of Yemen, and 4, any other measure that the parties believe could be used to improve trust. I reiterate this call that all parties to the conflict adhere to their obligations in terms of international humanitarian rights and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, South Africa remains concerned with the threat posed by safer oil tanker and lack of progress to allow technical experts to undertake an assessment and national repair in order to avoid an environmental and economic catastrophe for Yemen and its neighbors across the Red Sea. The threat must be dealt with on purely technical basis without politicization. In conclusion, Mr. President, we wish to reiterate that the only solution, sustainable solution to this conflict will be Yemen-led, Yemeni-owned political settlement that is inclusive and fair and puts the interest and well-being of all citizens of Yemen first. In this context, we also call for the full and meaningful participation of women in all aspects of inclusive political process and thank the Yemeni women for being the forefront for calling for the ceasefire and release of prisoners. Mr. President, let the Yemeni parties return to the inclusive Stockholm Agreement and national dialogue. The parties should be bold, courageous, decisive, as these uncertain times have demonstrated. Do not delay any further once you have reached an agreement. Act immediately for the sake of your children. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to the Dominican Republic. Jose, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank Martin and Ramesh for their briefing. Since our last meeting, the situation in Yemen has deteriorated considerably. First is the political context. The Southern Transitional Council declaration regarding a state of emergency and self-determination administration throughout the South is cause for concern that a new civil war will erupt in this part of the country. We know that it has been met with dismay from leaders of most Southern governments. Apart from aggravating the already volatile situation and complicating the country's COVID-19 response, the declaration raises serious concerns regarding the management of important institutions such as the central bank and the Port of Beirut. Yemen does not need further political fragmentation. Therefore, we reiterate that all parties need to scale up efforts to fully implement the Riyadh Agreement. In the north and central Yemen, fighting continues, and the Marib region continues to be threatened. We urge all parties to the conflict to create hostilities and get back to the negotiation table without further delay. Second is the pandemic. The World Health Organization reports that there is a full-blown transmission of the virus in Yemen, with the disease spreading undetected among the population with some of the lowest levels of immunity to the disease compared with other countries. Testing capabilities are inadequate, and we would like to echo the WHO's call to local authorities to transparently report confirmed cases. We are also aware that the ability to care for patients has been hampered by credible threats and perceived risks targeting certain international healthcare workers. This is unacceptable and a clear violation of international humanitarian law. Yemen urgently needs a unified response to the potential ramification of the pandemic. This includes both an increase in health sector spending and short-term fiscal policy that will mitigate the impact of a lockdown. Furthermore, with coronavirus spreading, authorities on both sides of the front line should work to release political detainees, including all of the journalists held by the Houthis. Another effect of the pandemic concerns stigmatization stigmatization and xenophobia towards migrants in Yemen as transmitters of disease. Xenophobia and scapegoating campaigns are leading to retaliation against these vulnerable communities, including physical and verbal harassment, forced quarantine, denial of access to health services, movement restrictions, and forced movements to frontline and desert areas, leaving them stranded without food, water, and essential services. The Special Envoy has said that Yemen cannot fight two fronts, the war and the pandemic. I would venture that there are not two, but four fronts, if we include climate extremes and the locust plague. Significant gains have been made against desert locust encroachment in Yemen, which proves what happens when the authorities and the international community join efforts and work together. But still, the battle is long and not yet over. According to Food and Agriculture Organization, more people are at the risk of losing their livelihoods, worsening food security in the coming months. We would like to express our full support to the efforts of the Special Envoy and his aims to fully include women and young people in all stages of the peace process. Voices such as Ola Al-Sakaf, the young Yemeni peace builder, must be heard. In her briefing to the Council last month, she made a point that in her young life, she has attended more funerals than weddings. Discussions of the future of Yemen must include the presence and input of future generations. Finally, we urge all parties to cease hostilities immediately and work together to rebuild their country. The Dominican Republic stands ready to support all efforts toward this goal, which is the only possible way to achieve peace and progress that Yemenis want and deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. I now give the floor to China.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Mr. Griffiths and Acting ASG Mr. Rajasingham for your briefings. China commends your efforts to promote a national ceasefire and improve the humanitarian situation in Yemen. These efforts are particularly significant in the face of COVID-19 pandemic. China has been following the situation in Yemen closely. We support the ceasefire appeal made by SG and his Special Envoy. We welcome the extended unilateral ceasefire made by Saudi Arabia on behalf of the coalition. All parties should make further efforts towards the same direction so as to reach and sustain a complete ceasefire together. China shares the concern of the SG and his Special Envoy about the instability in southern Yemen. The Council already issued a press statement in this regard, calling for expeditious implementation of the Riyadh Agreement. We reiterate the importance of Riyadh Agreement, which serves the interests of all parties. Confrontation and escalation are the last thing that Yemeni people need, especially at this difficult moment. Political settlement is the only way forward to end the conflict in Yemen. Years of conflicts have proved it's a war of no winners. China supports the Special Envoy's efforts to secure nationwide ceasefire, enhance confidence-building measures in humanitarian and economic areas, and restart inclusive political process. It is imperative that all parties to the conflict strengthen their political will and engage in broad dialogue and consultations. We urge all parties to stay in close contact under the coordination of Mr. Griffiths and encourage regional countries to continue to play a positive role. For China, our message is clear and consistent, and that is political settlement. Our embassy to Yemen has been in active engagement with the government of Yemen and also other parties in Yemen. The humanitarian situation in Yemen is alarming and compounded by COVID-19 pandemic, flood, power shortage, and other challenges. The fundamental interests of Yemen people are at stake. We urge all parties to demonstrate unity, jointly fight the pandemic, and improve livelihoods of the Yemen people. Last week, China donated 10,095 facial masks to Yemen's Ministry of Health and other humanitarian assistance, such as rice. We call on the international community and donor countries to step up their essential assistance to Yemen, especially in the upcoming virtual high-level pledging event on June 2nd. Meanwhile, the sovereignty, political independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Yemen must be fully respected. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to Indonesia, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me at the outset thank Special Envoy Martin Griffiths and ASG Ramesh Rajasingham for their comprehensive updates. It is unfortunate that despite the robust efforts of these gentlemen and their teams, things are still worrisome on the ground. Nevertheless, we are pleased to hear from Special Envoy that the government of Yemen has engaged constructively with the Special Envoy's proposals, and the Houthis also responded. We hope this effort will soon bear fruit. Almost every day, we are reading of incidents of escalation of the violence, armed groups taking over authority in the south, open conflict in the north, increasing COVID-19 infections, deterioration of the economy, or the plummeting value of the Yemen rial. Such news is in addition to about 80% of the population, about 24 million people still relying on humanitarian aid, with 10 million at risk of starvation. If nothing changes in the coming months, there could be complete collapse in Yemen, with nobody gaining anything from the tussle for control. We therefore fully support the efforts made by the Special Envoy to end the conflict and the suffering of the people of Yemen. Having said that, Mr. President, my delegation would like to highlight 3 points. First, a reminder to all of the agreed commitments. Considering how difficult it has been for the parties to even sit at the same table, the commitments laid out in the Stockholm and Riyadh agreements are monumental. We must therefore avoid the temptation to toss aside already implemented commitments just because others cannot yet be implemented. In our view, where there are contentious issues, the parties should focus on what can be implemented and work hard to make progress incrementally, as every step towards peace counts. In connection with this, we reiterate our strong concern at the deterioration of the Southern Transitional Council and reaffirm our commitment to Yemen's unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. It is critical to expedite implementation of the Riyadh Agreement. Second, permitting humanitarian assistance and supporting the authorities in addressing COVID-19. COVID-19 is a potent threat to Yemen, with the pandemic spreading fast and capable of being as deadly as the war itself. As mentioned by the ASG as of this morning, there were 72 confirmed cases, including 13 deaths from previously reported that Yemen only had confirmed 1 case. Sadly, With the healthcare system worn down by war, there is no capability in the country to respond. Indonesia therefore calls on the authorities to be transparent so as to enable international community respond accordingly and to allow appropriate humanitarian assistance. Third, a plea for the parties to work with the special envoy. We are in the holy month of Ramadan and will soon celebrate Eid al-Fitr, a wonderful time for the Ummah. There is no better time than this for the parties to lay down their weapons and focus on crafting a political settlement. At least we can have a humanitarian pause at least until the Eid al-Fitr, allowing room for dialogue and for the special envoy to work on the proposals and for the humanitarian workers to assist in the COVID-19 response. In this connection, we welcome the coalition's extension of the unilateral ceasefire and urge the Houthis to reciprocate immediately so as to stop the hostilities as well as counter COVID-19. Mr. President, we all hope for a miracle in Yemen, but this can only happen if all parties are committed to implementing the previous agreements and engage constructively with the special envoy to resume political process. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I give now the floor to the United States. Kelly, please.
Thank you, Sven. And, just a really special thanks to Martin. Martin, I've been keeping up with all of your meticulous work through the Secretary General, and I find your cautious optimism is very contagious, and you've got people rooting for you back here, especially from Kentucky, as I know that this is really an important time and a really very delicate issue in Yemen. So just know that you have people supporting you, and that we know firsthand the many countless hours that you're putting forward for peace and security in Yemen. Mark, I haven't seen Mark. I don't see him on the screen, but thank you so much for your briefing. And obviously the team, both of your teams, for all the work that they've done in helping you implement the peace and security in Yemen. The United States stands with the Yemeni people who have suffered every imaginable hardship and who are simply trying to survive in the midst of this conflict, food insecurity, devastating floods, and now the spread of COVID-19. In light of these hardships, we welcome the Saudi-led coalition's extension of its unilateral ceasefire in support of the UN peace process and efforts to fight COVID-19. The U.S. strongly urges the Houthis to join the government of Yemen in halting offensive operations in support of this ceasefire. This is so all parties may focus their efforts on countering COVID-19 and working towards a lasting political resolution of the conflict. The Houthis must recommit to de-escalation, followed by resumption of talks directed toward a political solution. We urge the parties to the conflict to continue to review and provide meaningful feedback on the special envoy's draft proposals, which represent the spirit of consensus required to move toward a lasting political settlement. We note the concern the recent declaration from the Southern Transitional Council of its so-called self-administration of Yemen's southern governance. Such actions from the STC will only distract the UN-led efforts to secure a nationwide ceasefire and a political solution. We are also concerned by reports of increasing STC interference in Central Bank of Yemen operations. All parties must continue to respect the government institutions underpinning Yemen's political and economic stability. We call on the STC and the Republic of Yemen government to re-engage in the political process provided under the Riyadh Agreement. Additionally, we remain concerned about limitations on humanitarian access in Houthi-controlled areas. The Houthis' deliberate interference with assistance operations, interference that is flagrant defiance of humanitarian principles, continues to limit the ability of the UN and other humanitarian organizations to provide for the needs of the most vulnerable Yemenis. We acknowledge some steps taken by the Houthis in certain areas, These include the decision to lift the 2% levy on aid projects, sign NGO agreements, and approve key independent needs assessments. But further progress is critical, especially on biometric registration and ensuring humanitarian staff can implement and monitor their programs. The United States also strongly encourages the Houthis to be fully transparent and report COVID-19 cases in order to facilitate an effective response for the Yemeni people. As we have said on previous occasions, the U.S. again calls on the Houthis to allow UN inspection and maintenance of the Safer oil tanker. UN officials must have immediate access to the Safer in order to prevent an environmental catastrophe, which would have far-reaching effects in Yemen and around the Red Sea. We are grateful to Martin Griffiths for continuing to raise this issue in Sadi. The Houthis must stop blocking a solution to this problem and permit required assessments and repairs. Finally, we urge all member states to fully comply with the targeted arms embargo established in the UN Security Council Resolution 2216, and we note our continued concern and ongoing reports of Iranian interference in the conflict, including through the provision of lethal aid to the Houthis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Estonia. I would like to thank Special Envoy Griffiths and Acting Assistant Secretary General Rajasingham for their briefings. It is most worrying that we are still witnessing fighting in Yemen despite the pressing need to cease military activity and focus on containing the spread of the coronavirus. We reiterate the call of the UN Secretary General to cease hostilities in Yemen, focus on reaching a negotiated political settlement, and do everything possible to counter the outbreak of COVID-19. With reportedly nearly half of the health facilities not functioning in Yemen, the spread of the virus would have devastating consequences for the people of Yemen, who are already suffering in the largest humanitarian crisis. We welcome the coalition forces' announcement of a 1-month extension to the ceasefire, and we urge the Houthis to uphold it as well. It is time for all sides to stop military activity and to resume talks, as it is the only way to effectively confront the pandemic, a common threat for everyone. We urge the parties to engage with the Special Envoy constructively and without delay, and make efforts to reach an agreement on starting a formal political process for ending the crisis. In addition to the ongoing fighting in the north, the latest developments in southern Yemen are also of great concern. The declaration of self-rule by the Southern Transitional Council and the subsequent clashes between the STC and the government forces undermine the efforts of the Special Envoy to resume talks and to end the war. We call on the government of Yemen and the Southern Transitional Council to cease the military activity and continue implementing the Riyadh Agreement, which would allow both parties to participate in the political talks and solving the conflict in Yemen. A solution to the conflict can only be achieved through a political compromise that addresses the legitimate concerns of all Yemenis. This calls for an inclusive and comprehensive political process mediated by the United Nations in full and meaningful participation of women and youth. We welcome the announcement of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia regarding hosting a donor conference to support Yemen on the 2nd of June. Regrettably, the restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian aid in Yemen are still in place and prevent the aid organizations to help those in need. Respecting humanitarian principles and securing unhindered and safe humanitarian access is an obligation for all parties in conflict. Securing the delivery of humanitarian supplies, including medical equipment, is especially important for preventing the spread of COVID-19. We also stress the necessity for all parties to comply with their obligations and under international humanitarian law and human rights law, and to ensure accountability for all violations and abuses. Special attention needs to be given to the protection of vulnerable populations, in particular women and children. We also call for the release of arbitrarily detained persons, including journalists and human rights defenders, who are facing the threat of contracting COVID-19 in crowded prisons. Finally, I would like to once more repeat our call for the Houthis to allow United Nations officials access to the safer oil tanker without delay in order to prevent an environmental disaster. Thank you very much, and I now resume my function as the President of the Council. I would now like to give the floor to the briefers to respond to the questions posed and comments made, if they wish so. Martin first, would you like to comment something? Yes. Yes. Yes.
I thought the permanent representative of Yemen, Sven, might want to come in first.
But usually it's after the first comments, because then there will be... No, it's first the Yemeni representative or cosmic.
I think so. I wouldn't want to get in the way. Thank you.
Okay. So I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen. Please go ahead.
His Excellency Ambassador Sven Jørgensen, President of Security Council, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Security Council, allow me at the outset to congratulate you, Mr. President, on assuming the presidency of Security Council for this month. I wish you and your friendly delegation every success. I also wish to extend my sincerest wishes of good health and well-being to you all in this challenging time. Mr. President, this war waged by Houthis has never been a choice of the Yemeni people, who long for peace and stability. The Yemeni government has tried to avoid war and achieve peace in various ways, including by making successive concessions and responding in good faith to calls of the SG of the United Nations and his special envoy, as well as to the initiative by the coalition to support legitimacy. Additionally, the government of Yemen has welcomed the statement of the Security Council calling for a ceasefire of all fronts, uniting efforts and mobilizing resources to combat the novel coronavirus pandemic, which has overwhelmed the world and it intensified the suffering of humanity. The government of Yemen reiterates its willingness to constructively and effectively engage with all genuine calls for comprehensive and sustainable peace in Yemen in accordance with the three agreed open terms of reference, namely the Gulf Initiative and its implementation mechanism, the outcome of the Comprehensive National Dialogue Conference, and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, primarily Resolution 2216, in order to build a better future free of armed militias, regionalism, and the divine rights to rule, and establish a fair, democratic, and civil federal state that lives up to the aspiration of Yemeni people. The government of Yemen responded and engaged positively and flexibly with the recent proposals of the Special Envoy Martin Griffiths for a comprehensive ceasefire, the implementation of economic and humanitarian measures, and the resumption of the political process. Whereas, at the same time, efforts of the Special Envoy are undermined by the Houthis' intransigence and rejection of these proposals. We call on the international community and the Security Council to exert pressures on the Houthi militias to comply with the calls of ceasefire, de-escalation, putting an end to the absurd war on the Yemeni people. Unfortunately, as is customary of them, the Houthi militias escalated their military operation in multiple front lines, launched ballistic missiles on civilians, neighborhood, and residential areas in the city of Marib, abusing the Yemeni government adherence to the escalation, killed a Yemeni female citizen after storming her house in Al-Bayda Governorate, committed the most heinous violations, including tortures, sexual violence, and rape against Yemeni females, detainees in Houthis prisoners, and flagrant violations of the Yemeni norms, value, and traditions, as well as the rules of the international humanitarian law and human rights law. It is high that the international community realize how these militias are engaging with these and all previous truces, and to realize the fact that the Houthi militias are merely an instrument serving the agenda of Tehran at the expense of Yemeni lives. Mr. President, the government of Yemen has made every effort to implement the Riyadh Agreement and remain willing to do so today. Though the intransigence of Southern Transitional Council and their declaration of what was called self-administration is a reckless step that constitutes a clear rejection of the provision of Riyadh Agreement and a continuation of arms rebellions of August last year. Besides STC's refusal to comply with the calls and statements issued by the coalition, numerous brotherly and friendly states, the international community, and the Security Council, which demand the STC retract their reckless action that impede the implementation of Riyadh Agreement and affect all efforts to achieve sustainability in Yemen. The STC continue to undermine the security and the stability in Socotra Governorate, and more recently carry out provocative military mobilization in Abyad. The government of Yemen stresses that the need of the STC to comply with all the calls to withdraw its unconstitutional declaration, return to the implementation of Riyadh Agreement and its provision in accordance with the agreed open implementation matrix, and immediately cease all measures and practice that disturb and undermine the work of state institutions, intervene the performance of its functions, seize control of state assets and resources in the interim capital of Aden, and disturbing the work of the Ministry of Health team tasked with combating the COVID-19 pandemic, especially during the worsening situation in Aden Governorate as a result of the recent natural disaster and the surge in the number of confirmed coronavirus cases. Mr. President, the Supreme National Emergency Committee of COVID-19, in coordination with the local authority in the liberated governorates, is strengthening to preventive and treatment efforts and is continuously coordinating with the Yemeni partners and with the Yemeni partner state and international organization to ensure increased support in this area. Further, the Supreme National Emergency Committee for COVID-19 warns that the continuous manipulation and tampering with the coronavirus pandemic issue by the Houthi militias, their adoption of obfuscation policy and the lack of transparency regarding the actual number of cases hinders the efforts to combat the pandemic and put the life of millions of Yemenis at risk. We call on the WHO to urgently intervene and pressure the militias to share health information and to transparently declare the actual number of cases to prevent an approaching disaster and preserve millions of civilian lives. Moreover, we invite the brotherly and friendly countries and international organizations to provide urgent medical assistance and support to save civilian life through the provision of adequate health for those infected, conducting early testing on large scale, and ensuring health workers are equipped with the standards protective personal equipment and the necessary medical devices and ventilators to contain the spread of the pandemic, especially in the light of the fragile health section in Yemen. I cannot fail to mention and thank the brotherly Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for organizing and hosting the 2020 Donors Conference for Yemen, which will be held on June 2nd with the participation of the United Nations. The government of Yemen calls on the international community and donors countries to take initiative to effectively contribute to the financing of relief, humanitarian, and development response program in Yemen and support the efforts aimed at making this conference a success. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Houthis militias continue to deny the United Nations technical team access to the floating oil tanker Safar Ras Isa. The government holds the Houthis
I'm sorry, we lost your voice, your sound. Abdullah, we lost your sound.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The Houthi militias continue to deny the United Nations technical team access to the floating oil tanker Safar Ras Isa. The government holds the Houthi militias fully responsible for the repercussions of an oil spill from the tanker and for the potential environmental and economic implications if the tanker situation remains unresolved. We call on the international community and the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility and pressure the Houthi militias to respond to the efforts of the United Nations and to take the necessary measures to avoid an environmental disaster in the Red Sea. Mr. President, we express our concern regarding the announcement by Houthi militias that they will use the revenue in the special account in Hodeidah branch of the Central Bank of Yemen. So this revenue will not be used for paying civil servant salary. It would be used for financing their war efforts. And this revenue should be used until the establishment of a mutually acceptable mechanism for managing this revenue. And we call on Al-Houthis to comply with their commitment, and we urge the Security Council to exert pressures on Al-Houthis to stop this reckless action that will impact on the process of peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. And we now bid farewell to the representative of Yemen and thank him for his participation in the meeting. And this concludes the live broadcast portion of this meeting. Thank you, Abdullah.
Thank you very much, brothers. See you later. We hope all the best.